Hi again, this is Matt, and this is the Sandbox. First one we're talking about, the ASA 2.0, but we're going to dig a little deeper into how to launch the Sandbox to get it working the way that we need to do. We'll probably do a focus on just the actual GNS3 virtual machine, because I talked about how there was a lot of changes and stuff, and it's kind of important to go over that so that if you're going to try to actually attempt to do this Sandbox, you need to know everything about the GNS3 VM. It's right in the center of this whole Sandbox. Okay, so we're at my desktop, and we basically need to understand in what order to launch the applications. So because GNS3 depends on this VM, then logically you're going to have to know that you got to launch the VM first. So the GNS3 VM gets launched first. Let me go ahead and run that. I have a VMware Workstation Pro. You might have to pay for that, you might not. But the important thing is you got to launch the VM first. And since we're in here, let's take a look at all the little tweaks I did on this VM so that somebody can come back behind me and steal it. Let's skip this version. I don't want it. First of all, the memory is ungodly. It's 8 gigs. That's a lot of memory. But I found over time it's actually what you're going to need if you're going to run a bunch of applications to communicate to whatever devices you have in the GNS3 topology. It's also handling the actual processes to loading. So you want to be nice to this GNS3 VM. You want to give it as much as you possibly can reasonably do on your host system. I happen to be running on a laptop that has 32 gigs of memory and has a Intel, I think 8th generation processor. No, Core. Let me see. Yeah, 8th generation processor, which means I have 8 logical CPUs or cores. So the important thing is that I gave it 2 logical processors, 8 gigs. I've got an initial hard disk of 20 gigs, and then I have a second one of 500. I mean, this is a massive scaling up of the GNS3 VM to kind of cover some key points here, right? It's handling the GNS3 work, but it's also going to be my client running requests and that kind of stuff to each of the individual machines using the same, well, I shouldn't say same, using the interface that it's connecting with. Let's just say that, because there's actually layers of interconnections here. We're gonna talk about that real quick in describing these network adapters. So let's just kind of take a look at that real quick. All right. So it took a lot of thought and consideration into, what adapters does GNS3 need? So GNS3 has usually 2 adapters that come together, but it's how it's connecting, right? So the first one we're doing is this custom VMnet 8. It's a NAT, which essentially means it's going to leverage some VM network. And that's referring to, and if you get out of this, it's referring to this virtual network editor, and here it is, right? It's this 192.168.124 network. That's fine. That's fine. But for you to actually dig in deeper and kind of look at how it's actually going to work, when you give yourself administrator privileges, you now have this other one that I see, the VNet 0. That's bridged to my actual physical Qualcomm adapter on my host laptop. And why would I do that? Just think about it for a second. What's the advantage of having the network editor see these 2 networks? Well, the network editor, this network editor is going to really act as your router, effectively. It's going to know about this local 192.168.124 network, but it's also going to provide some very key services here. So if you look down here, it says use local DHCP server to distribute the IP address to VMs. Well, I took whatever VMware gave me as far as the network and the subnet mask. So for those of you who don't understand subnetting, What this is basically saying is the network identifier is 192.168.124, but the 0 is left open for the hosts, which means you have 254 possible hosts. In my humble opinion, that's way too much for a network simulator. You might want to change that subnet mask to, get it down to the very minimum that you need. That's just building in security. Not that it's actually necessary in a sandbox, but it's just good practice to kind of think about subnetting. But I just cared about mocking this up and getting it to work, right? So that basically means that the virtual network editor is going to run a small little program, a little DHCP server, and this DHCP server, if we take a look at the settings, will start issuing IP addresses in a range, right? It's going to start at the 128 range, and it's going to stop at the 254. Now, a little thing that's not really talked about is your host machine, whichever machine you're connecting to, should be in that same subnet. So bottom line is, what you're taking away from this is this is how this virtual network editor is set up. How this is defined is going to play a huge part on how your device is going to connect. Okay, that's kind of why we got to take a look at this. Excuse me. So we're done with that. Here's this VMnet 0. It's bridged, which just simply means it's binding to my wireless adapter. So what's the benefit of that? Well, if you set a second interface to this GNS3 VM and you specifically tell it to bind to the wireless adapter of your laptop, what should happen is when there's a request or a broadcast out for an IP address, it's going to be the DHCP service on your home router. So people will be like, whoa, what? Why would you want to do that? Well, I think it's a good idea. So you have interconnectivity between the GNS3 VM and your devices inside GNS3 using that typical NAT interface. It does go out to the internet, but I have a second adapter that actually has a local IP address so that any of my machines inside the local network of my home can hit GNS3 through the web browser. Kind of cool, right? And I'll kind of show you how that works in another video. But this is how this video is just about setting up the GNS3 VM. So that's a couple little tweaks you do. It's not here or there, but it's just something I thought it would be fun to kind of show. All right, so that's actually taken care of. That's out of the way. We understand this is a very big virtual machine, and it's highly customized as we launch it. Okay, so we're going to launch this virtual machine. Again, the boot up process is not the same. You're not going to see this anywhere else. This is just Matt's virtual machine. So we'll just wait for a minute to load. Oh yeah, and while we're waiting for it to load, I saw the comment on the first video I posted. I'm not a big YouTube star. I don't budget for cameras and lights and everything. This is just a dude out on the internet who doesn't care. I'm kind of old now. I'm at the point where I'm just like, let me just give you what I'm doing, and I don't worry about the fluff. So if you like fluff, there's a ton of dudes out there that want to get you onto Cisco CCNA track. I'm just talking about the sandboxes. Okay, so now the GNS3 is running. Okay, it's running. Services are up. We'll talk about the interfaces that GNS3 has in a second. But now we're going to switch gears and launch GNS3. Okay, so if the GNS3 VM's running, you did a good job when over here, the main server here. This is the main server of how I have it configured to connect to that VM. Okay, you did it right when it's pulling up the projects inside the GNS3 VM. So it made a call, and down here, this is a really useful tool. I think most common users will see this tool once in a while. The GNS3 console is running in the background, and it'll barf at you if you're not connected right. I mean, it's just so fickle. It's just gonna like scream at you. So if you don't see anything here in this lower window, that's a good thing. That's a really good thing. But let's just talk about that real quick. I mean, if you do, like help, something like, there we go. So there's a lot of things you could do. You can run debug on this thing if you're having issues. But basically, use this visually as you're trying to set up your environment. It'll tell you what it is. And I think, to GNS3's credit, since I left, problems used to just get posted on message boards. It was a godly mess. But now you could Google it, and it'll direct you to the right GNS3 page. So I would definitely keep an eye on that while you're working in this. Okay. So let's go back in here and talk about the GNS3 VM. So now that we've taken a look at the VMware, you have to specify the actual IP address of the GNS3 VM as it was assigned in the VMware Virtual Network Manager. Does that make sense? So it's kind of cool because when we take a look at this virtual machine, and let me see if we can pull it up now. Let's take a look at the interfaces, right? Let's do terminal. Let's see. Let's take a look at these interfaces. There's a lot of stuff going on in here, and we'll just try to break it down. Loopback we don't care about. This first interface, it shows that it's up, and it's got this 10 dot whatever 154. Well, that goes into me binding to my wireless NIC card, and it actually did receive an IP address from the DHCP in my home router, whatever vendor, whatever blah 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 blah. So now this GNS3 VM has connectivity to the local subnet in the house. Why? I just wanted to connect to it. Okay, we'll get into that, because if I ever wanted to open up, well, let me just show it to you then. If I ever wanted to open a browser, let me see if we can open another window here. 10.00.154. So let's take a look at that. So now I'm actually hitting it from my host machine, and you've got this like sort of like EVE-NG looking thing. Like, I think this was kind of I don't know why you want it to look like EVE-NG, but basically this is a web version. So I guess you could open the same topology, but I don't know. It's just, I don't get it. So I'm too stupid to understand what the heck this is about. But the point is, I can hit this box through my local network, right? What if I needed to transfer some files or something? I can SSH into the box. I can WinSCP and move my files back and forth. Yeah, you could use the VMware tools, but you don't have to. You've now got it networked. So I could take my host machine or any machine on the network. If I had a file on like machine 12 somewhere in another bedroom, I could just WinSCP it into it. So everybody has access, reachability to this GNS3 virtual machine. It lives now on the network with that interface. So that's kind of the reason why I did that. Let's see, where is the important one? Okay, right here. So the second the second Ethernet interface actually received a 192.168.124.128 from the VMware DHCP service. I just talked about that. So now it also has been assigned a second IP address from a separate DHCP service running in VMware, the workstation. That's really cool. Because then, when you set up your ASA, you're going to, a little trick I do that a lot of techs don't pick out right away is when you're setting up a virtual machine inside GNS3, you got to do a couple steps, but then once the steps are done, it just makes sense that inside interface makes a request to a DHCP. And whichever DHCP service it is, it'll receive an IP address. And it's really cool to see that. Because now you don't have to sit there and kind of manually configure the IP address and kind of figure out which interface it is. Oh, it's a mess. A little trick I do is set the first interface that's going out of your GNS3 topology to DHCP. Let the DHCP server that's actually running or connecting, it's always going to be that first DHCP server. And I think a lot of new users think, well, I have this home router at 10, blah, 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 blah. I'm just going to manually hard code. Don't do that. You actually have multiple DHCP services running in your box. I almost guarantee you don't know which one's going to respond first. So why don't you set the first interface to DHCP, then when you get a response back, you know which DHCP service is actually connected on the other end of that link. It's just something I figured out. It's not a big whoop-de-doo. It's just, but I'm going to show you that it actually did work. Let's take a look at that GNS3 topology. Well, hold on. Let me see what time I have on this, because I don't have a lot of time. 1 second. Yeah, I might have to make that for the next video. Sorry for the cliffhanger, but I'm going to have to show you guys the ASA interfaces and that DHCP little trick at another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.